You're listening to the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT podcast. I'm your host and curator, Rabbi Avraham Kivelevitz, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Clear the aisles, the Projectionist Has Semicha. Hi, I'm here with Kolakowski and joined by a very old friend, a dear, dear person to me that's a blast from the past, 100%, my good friend Yacov Freedman joining us from Atlanta. Great to have both of you guys over here. And, you know, I'm from Tennessee. Yaakov's living in Atlanta. The South is really never far from my mind. I think the older I get, the more I feel Memphis the way I do. The personality that I guess loomed so large in my life was Elvis. I think, you know, I think I told you the anecdote that when I came to Israel, to Eretz Yisrael, in 1977, I had been on the plane for, 40 something hours till I got there with tremendous effort to get to Israel and realize my dream and to be in Eretz Yisrael. And one of my first mornings in the hallowed Yeshiva of Mir, as I was walking and trying to find a place to learn to sit down, I happened to either knock over or trip over or somehow nudge into a wonderful, smiling person who was so friendly to me. Turns out he was from Bnei Brak, and he was a grandnephew of the most illustrious rabbinic figure, the Chazon Ish. And he starts talking to me, and he says to me, Memphis, and he says, the Elvis, the city of Elvis. Yes, I know. And he says, no, this Spalti, I'm so surprised. Yesh Mishum in Memphis. I said to him back, I said, I'm surprised. I need Spalti. Shani also mitoch yeshivat mir she'achyon shel hachazon ish yagid li al Elvis. I said, I'm so surprised that someone in the middle of the Mir Yeshiva, who's a grade of the Chazon Ish, has met right after Elvis died. So I guess that mushroom cloud of his death was actually moving even in places like Eretz Yisrael, Bnei Brak, and in Yerushalayim. But clearly, Elvis is still, I believe, as it says at the end of Buzz Luhrmann's film, he's still the top-selling vocalist of all time. I looked today when I was looking through my Apple Music, I saw that there's still Elvis albums that they are putting out. They're remixing some of the original Elvis songs with, in some modern way. His stuff is still selling. He's still, and in fact, whatever you think of this movie, and we're not talking about Buzz Luhrmann's movie, although you can mention it if you want, Yaakov. I know Yitzchak, you haven't seen it. Clearly, Elvis is still, Elvis has incredible currency, and I'm not sure when his currency is going to end together. I think the only similarity might be Sinatra. It might be that Sinatra was already, before he had ever stepped in front of a movie camera, had already become, I think, through the end of the 30s and the mid 40s, let me say it better, he'd already become a vocal sensation. And he was nudging Crosby out. All the Bobby Soxers and girls were going nuts about him. I don't believe that he had any film presence. And I think there was a similar idea. Let's get this guy into the movies. He'll sing in the movies. He'll bring people to the movies. I think that's sort of a similar phenomena to what was on people's minds about putting Elvis in. What do you think, Yacov? I think it's the closest in terms of similarity.
I mean, sure, but you could go back to Al Jolson and say that he was an original example of that. I think the pre-war expectations of movie stardom were much more broad. You know, you had to be a lot of different things. You had to be a hyphenate. You had to be a singer. You had to be a dancer. You had to be an actor. And if you weren't any of those three things, they could teach you. So there were just expectations that people were very talented. And they learned everything because a lot of them came from the stage or they came from vaudeville.
I agree with you. You have, Fanny Brice was a vaudeville burlesque star, and then they said, let's put her into the movies. I agree with you. There was this idea we could put anybody into movies. We can make anybody. We'll put anybody into the movies, and we'll make a movie about them. But the idea of someone being a sensation, like a word, like to the point, oh, we've got to get this guy into the movies, and let's create the vehicle. And again, you're correct. There's probably examples. Maybe even Will Rogers is an example of that. Will Rogers was I don't even know what you would call him, an entertainer, a person of
a humorist
that was famous everywhere. We'll get him in the movies. The movies was the up and coming way to bring that person to the world. I think the difference, though, between when you have Sinatra and Elvis is that the movies already had grown up a little bit. They'd already had a certain basic studio structure. And now the question was, let's meld it around. Let's get this vehicle. Let's put him in a type of Western. Let's put him in Now, before we get to Elvis, although Elvis had moves, I'd have to say Elvis couldn't really do much except sing. I mean, you wouldn't call him. I mean, Sinatra was able to hold his own a little bit, and On the Town, he was able to hoof a little bit, right? He was able to get a little bit of dancing done. You wouldn't call him, and I think he was also in Anchors Away as well. So Sinatra, and you're right, maybe it was, but I don't think Elvis, and I've seen Elvis's moves when Elvis, like when they have all the singers and dancers around him, Elvis is on his own. I mentioned Judy Garland to you off pod, and I mentioned her just now as they probably helped her. She was part of the Gum Sisters. I'm sure she had to do a lot of those moves, a lot of those dances, a lot of those classical stuff. But here I think Hollywood said, and whether it was Colonel Tom said, let's get this guy who was so sensational, who everywhere he goes, he's a magnet. Let's put him into movies, and we'll just make a boatload of money. I think that was the idea. There
was another goal too. The other goal was that Elvis had something of a salacious reputation. He was Elvis the pelvis, and he was scandalous in the way that he danced and in the way that his music would combine things. So the goal of going to Hollywood wasn't just to get him on the big screen to make a ton of money, but it was to clean up his image. It was after he went to the Army. And Colonel Parker saw this opportunity as, first of all, using the Army as a way to make him much more squeaky clean. But then when he went to Hollywood, he did all these family-friendly movies. So it toned down his image in a way that made him much more acceptable to, middle America. And it broadened his appeal quite a bit, so that when he eventually got out of movies, he had a much bigger audience than he
in my past. The first Elvis film that I saw was 1966's, I believe, Frankie and Johnny. And I saw it, I think it was on an NBC Saturday night at the movies in 1969, which shows you the film didn't have much of a box office because it got into TV pretty early. And for me, when I was watching the film, I knew who Elvis was, but I also saw Ellie Mae in that film. Donna Douglas was in that film as well. And of course, to me, I was so excited because here's one of my favorite sitcom stars from the Beverly Hillbillies. And here she was without that, ridiculously exaggerated Southern accent that she did as Ellie Mae. And hey, she's smart. You know what I'm saying? She's not just she's not just a bubblehead. She's singing. So there were a number of things there that struck me about the Elvis movie. And I came to realize that, hey, they have Elvis in these movies. They have these other people in movies. And of course, Donna Douglas was one of her minor co-stars. If you look into the whole, you had Anne Margaret, of course, famously in Viva Las Vegas, and a number of other, various Hollywood people and character actors and some starlets and others. But in Buzz Luhrmann's film, and I think that's probably the attitude of most people, most of these Elvis films that he made as a actor in this formula were forgettable. I remember it happened at the World's Fair, was the first time I ever knew anything about Seattle when I saw that film, because it was about the Seattle World's Fair, and there was a Space Needle and other things like that. So the films were very light in plot. Elvis played pretty much the same character, and then there were songs that were written for Elvis. Now, other than Jailhouse Rock, which was basically a redoing of, I guess, a LP that he'd already made, most of those songs that he sang were more like they weren't what we would call the real rock and roll songs. They were more ballads and popular versions, and they were turned into records. I think if you whether it was RCA, whoever he had to deal with, the movies were a means to sell not only to get people into the theater, but to sell the record. Seemed that much. They were coming out 1, 2 a year, 3 a year. There was novelty in the beginning. There was a certain excitement, but I think, as you point out, by the end, Elvis, his film career was sputtering. I think one of the last films that he made was Stay Away Joe, which supposedly maybe was Speedway or who knows. Anyway, the point is that those movies were it was considered objectionable on every single standard, in terms of every trope and prejudicial point you can make against Native Americans. Again, I'm not doing justice. Elvis lovers, yes, girls, whatever. But we know that Elvis's movies, none of them are going to be preserved, I guess, as some of the greatest films of the 20th century. I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about the concert film that became a concert film, not the film That's the Way It Is. I want to talk about what happened in 1968. And I must not have been watching TV that night. I'm not sure if it was a Friday night or not. But I discovered it probably when I was in Skokie. I discovered the Comeback album, which was it's a central part of Lerman's film, and it was featured, and it came out around Christmas time, 1968. It became later known as the Comeback Special because Elvis went back to who he was. Elvis went back to that boy from 1956 or 55 to 58 before he went into the army. Elvis did things. He looked different. He moved different. He sang with a type of passion and power that he hadn't sang up until that point. And when you watch this Comeback Special, now the Comeback Special was about an hour with commercials. The commercials, by the way, were less intrusive than they are today. So I think it was about 55 minutes. I think, and maybe Singer, that was sponsoring it, went easy on the amount of commercial time this way because they wanted to give as much of Elvis as possible. And it really is a time capsule of 1968 in terms of what they tried to do with the trick photography. But that part, I think, is less impressive than just seeing the person performing by himself or with a guitar or with his band around him. It is the first time I saw it, it was electrifying. I watched it again in preparation of talking with you guys today. It still is it is so powerful to see him and to see, although the audience, they said they called in from people, outside of the studio to just come in. You cannot fake the type of impressions, the type of incredible awestruck smiles and the aspects of desire that you see on both men and women's faces when you see the audience reacting to Elvis during these sessions. Now, it was filmed over a couple of days and it was spliced together, but watching that special, and since the special came out so many years ago, the Elvis Files have discovered all the outtakes. They've discovered all aspects that weren't put into it. And if you get the original, if you get the 4-set disc, you can get every little thing that was connected to that special. I have seen it all because it's fascinating. It's the power that he exudes, the raw energy, the dexterous control of his voice, the ability that he had to go from one genre of song to another and remain with all that authentic, as if his kishkas, his heart, was lying out on that square, was incredible. And again, it could be there are flashes in the films where you see that, but I think watching this is like, it's almost like opening up your vein and inserting Elvis into your arm. I have to say, there is a part of the special where they sort of do a little bit of a movie where he's a guitar man, and he's going on a little journey, and he's meeting a whole bunch of wanton women. But I think that in terms of, and that part you could skip. There's another part of the film, another part of the special, where they have Elvis talking with his boys about where rock and roll comes from. And it's interesting that he talks about the Beatles, he talks about the Byrds, he mentions how impressed he is somewhat with them, but he really says that the roots of rock and roll go into rhythm and blues and soul and gospel. He also mentions, by the way, that he's very impressed by what sound technicians can do, which of course is what they've all done with Elvis from that time on. They've all mixed him and remixed him, so he knew what he was talking about. But when he talks about rhythm and blues and gospel, the special takes you to the song "Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child," and a black man performing a beautiful ballet scene where he is acting out the words. And I don't think it's Mahalia Jackson who's singing, but it's like it has that type of spirit. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. And although they were afraid to put an actual cross, they give you the sense that this is a church. And Elvis talks about the kingdom come, and he talks about the glory. Again, TV and movies, Yacov and Yitzhak were very afraid of being openly Christian or openly religious in any way. But this section was trying to meld gospel with rock, and gospel with Elvis specifically. And what they also did was they made sure to feature, and not in like what I would say in a virtue signaling way, black dancers and black singers. Not only Elvis's backup group, but just and it was just in a natural way. And I think that also reflected not only the spirit of the 1968, where there was a spirit of love, but also Elvis's real connection, which Lerman brings out in the film. You know, he almost hammers you over it with an anvil, how much he was connected to the African-American background that around Tupelo and in Memphis. But you can see that in this special as well. Even in that sort of garish, you know, like where he's the guitar man and he's going into various brothels and other places, black women are there dancing and as attractive and as involved with him as the white women that are around him. The love interest is some sort of Priscilla clone, someone who sort of has that sort of attitude and looks a little bit, I guess, like her. But there's black women, and not only in any sort of just backup singer way, just as being beautiful and equal completely to all the white dancers and singers. So I think that it's a very uplifting way, in a sense. That's another wonderful thing about it. The other part of the film, the other part of the special, which, as you remember, Lerman makes a big deal about, is the fact that the ending of the special, it was, whether he was supposed to end with a Christmas song or not, he does sing Blue Christmas in the special. He does sing Blue Christmas. And he sings it as he's sitting down with the boys, with the Memphis boys around him. But at the end of the special, he sings If I Can Dream. And it was a song that was written by a couple of Jewish guys. And of course, I think Binder, who was the director, was also Jewish. But I have to tell you, it gives me chills to hear it. I don't know if you felt the same way when you heard him say "If I Can Dream." Um, it's true. Elvis was definitely moved by the assassination of Martin Luther King. I didn't know if he was, connected to Robert Kennedy or not, but I think that the hearing Elvis, all by himself without any of the fancy dancers and singers around him, coming out in a white suit, and in a solemn way, singing "If I Can Dream." And again, I want to just to ask you guys if you think the lyrics are just hokey or not. Let me share the lyrics with you just for. There must be lights burning brighter somewhere. Got to be birds flying higher in a sky more blue. If I can dream of a better land where all my brothers walk hand in hand, tell me why, oh why can't my dream come true? There must be peace and understanding sometime. Strong winds of promise that'll blow away the doubt and fear. If I can dream of a warmer sun where hopes keep shining on everyone, tell me why, oh why won't that sun appear? Yeah. We're lost in a cloud with too much rain. We're trapped in a world that's troubled with pain. But as long as a man has the strength to dream, he can redeem his soul and fly. Deep in my heart is a trembling question. Still, I'm sure that the answer is going to come somehow. Out there in the dark, there's a beckoning candle. Yeah. And while I can think, while I can talk, while I can stand, while I can walk, while I can dream, oh, please let my dream come true right now. Let it come true right now. Now there's an oh yeah after that. But that's the lyrics. Now, of course, I didn't want to try to imitate Elvis singing it. I have to tell you that before we talked tonight, I wanted to see who covered that song. And I saw Barry Manilow, who's, of course, one of our tribe, that I don't know if you could compare him to Elvis. Wow, trapped in a world that's full of pain instead of troubled with pain. And it's full, and again, it's a world that's troubled by pain. Also, he changed the word of beckoning candle to burning candle. And beckoning is so great. A candle that's beckoning. The candle's out there just beckoning us, not just burning, it's beckoning us to change things. The one thing that is missing from this song is God, right? The one thing that's missing from this song is if it would be, it's appealing to people. Now, do you think that, again, obviously it's very similar to the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech. But you think, what do you guys think? Are the lyrics hokey? I don't know. I actually feel that they're very important even for today. What do you guys think?
A lot of songs were that hokey back then.
Yeah.
I mean, I shouldn't say that, but protest songs and message songs all had a bit of a sledgehammer effect. So I appreciate that you like the lyrics. They are better. Barry Manilow probably softened them because it might have worked with the meter better. He's Barry Manilow is a performer. He was a lot like Elvis in that he's very much tied to the audience, and he knows what the audience wants, and he knows how to give it to them. But I don't know. I think that scene was in the Baz Luhrmann movie.
Yes, it was. It was.
And connecting it so overtly to the King assassination almost diminished the scene. Mm-hmm. It made it too obvious, and it made it just too there was a bit that Elvis was fighting with his manager in order to get it on, but that wasn't as interesting as the actual performance. What he does as a performer sort of transcends all of these easy, pop psychological interpretations. So,
or maybe what we could say is like this: the words themselves sound very similar to the types of I guess now tropes of, hey, why can't we all get together? Why can't we have brotherhood? Why can't there be this sun for a better world for all of us? But Elvis's soul that he invests into that song, his body movements, the really cause him to be the author of the song. He really owns it. And I think that's why the song has not been covered that often. Blowing in the Wind has been covered quite a bit. There's probably hundreds. I think, again, Luhrmann, we're not talking about Buzz Luhrmann and Moulin Rouge and any of his films, but he isn't about subtlety. We know that, right? He's about, like you say, sledgehammer, super special effects imagery. My point, though, is Luhrmann's film spurred me to go see the real thing. Luhrmann thinks that, Elvis is still something. And I know, despite all the issues that surrounded him, that this was not inauthentic. Now again, you might want to say that everybody was doing protest songs. What can we say, Yacov? I mean, there's certain, I mentioned to you about Judy Garland earlier. There's certain performers, it's just you have to say that in that moment, they are not faking it.
No, I don't think Elvis was faking it. I think that was what you're saying about Elvis is that he was all these contradictions. He was religious, but he was profane. He was black, but he was white. He was gospel, but he was rock. They're all true. He was trying to do, and he did naturally just bridge all of these audiences. That's one of the reasons he was so popular. It's one of the reasons that the people around him thought that he could bridge even more gaps, and they wanted him to be the family-friendly sex symbol, which is insane. Right. But that's what they said. If anybody could pull this off, it's him. And he really believed these things. And I think this is something that the Baz Luhrmann movie gets right, is that he grew up in this weird cross-cultural moment and place, where he lived was really just, he was the poor white guy in the black community, and he learned stuff that other people didn't learn, and he felt it, and he legitimately lived that life, and he experienced it, and he related to it in a way that most of the singers of that time, the Beatles, they had their message at that point. They were already incredibly counterculture, but they weren't experiencing hardship. They couldn't say, they could write about Eleanor Rigby, but then when they performed it, it sounded like Paul McCartney singing Eleanor Rigby. It wasn't the same as Elvis Presley, who was basically breaking down on stage. And that was part of his, power. He was a great, great performer. He really knew how to command the stage, but also knew how to get the emotion out of himself to the point where he can make something super memorable.
Wonderfully said. And I think you have to add to that, Yacov, that it was almost a savant-like gift. Even Judy, as natural as she was, they had the voice coaches working with her. We'll talk about Fred Astaire. Fred Astaire always talked about, working with the choreographers, getting all those moves right. Elvis, although I'm sure, he worked with his musicians about getting a certain note to put in, but the actual singing talent, the actual vocal ability seemed to have been just innate within him. It wasn't like, he had to go to like a Pavarotti or someone to somehow learn how to master this instrument. And again, I don't have Elvis's bio perfectly, but I never have heard that he was ever sent anywhere. We have so many, and maybe that's part of the reason why, we talk about his films being a dud. There was sort of no way that as an actor, he could become even close to what he could do as a singer. Right. He was, when he did act, when he was supposed to, he wasn't a stiff mannequin completely, but it was so, it was so below what would happen. People have said the same thing about Fred Astaire, that when Fred Astaire did his dancing, that was angelic. That was sort of like you were transported when he did dancing scenes, however he did, with Ginger Rogers, whoever it was. And then the rest of the film, the acting and, and the issues that were going on, they seem to be, like, who cared? Maybe the closest Astaire came to really putting his neshama into some acting was probably The Bandwagon, like where you get to see a little bit of him struggling with his age and what he's about. But still, I guess whenever you have someone who is so great in something, the film is always going to be, it's not going to be able to match up and I guess that's part of the reason why, the formulaic aspect of all the Ginger Rogers Astaire film have somewhat of a similar nature to we're talking here about Elvis. The problem, of course, with Elvis is the musical numbers were like you say, they needed to be toned down. That's why when you see this special, I think you see the real Elvis. You see, whether it's Trouble, whether it's Heartbreak Hotel, whether it's You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog, there you're seeing, you're seeing the koach, you're seeing the energy, some of the hip moves, the pelvic moves. That's where you're seeing him, and it's unfortunate that I think that's the only place in film that you can find him. I want to say that I did start Yacov. It was on HBO Max. I was able to find That's the Way It Is, which is another Elvis concert film, and it really struck me as being, too full of cinematic tricks, and they speed up the camera. They do a number of things there that, and another thing why it's hard for me to watch it. I think something happened to him, and again, this is not really from 68 to 70. He only aged 2 years. When you look at him in 1970, you already see the puffiness. You already see the roundness that later became, such it's almost sickening to watch. Those of us who really remember Elvis as a younger person, and to see him, and I think that part, going back to Buzz Luhrmann's film, that last concert, if you remember that scene that I'm talking about, I mean, the prosthetics there. I mean, that was the actor Butler. Let's say it again. The actor Austin Butler that was in those prosthetics, with Elvis not being able to stand up, but singing Unchained Melody. I mean, that was again, this is not a recommendation of Luhrmann's film, but that was a great directorial decision to actually describe his death and his funeral, and then go back and again, in the film, what he could have done was have that as the penultimate scene, then talk about his burial and have Jimmy Carter's speech. But what they did instead was put him into the ground, talk about how the icon that he was with the president, and then have a flashback again to that last time on stage in 1977, the fat guy who could barely stand up. But when he started to sing, and he started to sing Unchained Melody, and he started to, that I thought was probably the best.
I do want to point out that, who really didn't like Elvis's movies was Elvis. He was probably his harshest critic. He knew they were beneath him, and he knew that he was better served with the camera simply pointed at him on stage. And that's why when I think he made these specials, they were really comeback specials to him, not because he went anywhere. He was still really in the public eye. He simply wanted to say, I'm coming back to myself.
Yes.
It was,
right.
So
yeah,
he would make jokes, by the way, when he was on stage, and he would make jokes about his movies.
Yeah.
Right. They generally didn't make air, but he would find a reason to. In the
comeback special, he does say, worthwhile at all? Again, I don't know. You work for TCM. Does TCM? Do you ever note how many hits you get? Do Elvis's films? Do people watch them?
Elvis has fans. His movies definitely have folks who turn up for them. And every time we do, let's say, a birthday tribute to him, there will be a lot of people who are excited about it. and it sparks debate. Some people always complain that the movies are, not great. Not that everything that's shown on air is great, but other people come to his defense and say, maybe, yes, there's stuff that isn't great, but it has, Barbara Stanwyck will show up every now and then. And as you said, his co-stars are always kind of, interesting, and they have different appeals to different people. And they're definitely drenched in this weird nostalgia for a time in America, the travelogue aspect of it, where he would go, he'd be in this place in one movie and he'd be in another place in another movie. And that was very much part of a time and place. And, movies tried to do that. They tried to transport the viewer in, to differentiate from.
In the Elvis films, especially towards the end, they were mostly on the soundstage. They would, like, even when Elvis was supposed to be in London and Paris and all those places, it was just back projection screen. Whether it was Parker who wouldn't let him go or whatever it was, it was nothing like the travelogues that Hitch did. I mean, when Hitch took you to places, or even Stanley Donen imitating Hitch in Charade or other places, they actually took you. But you wanted to put in a vote when I talked to you earlier. You felt that Elvis didn't ring any bells for you. Make your case for the other Tennessee. I wouldn't call him, I guess, a tenor. You would call him, right, or a baritone. Make your case for the other Tennessee tenor / baritone.
Well, somehow Johnny Cash strikes me as much more of a authentic character. I don't know. He doesn't. He really seems to mean whatever he says. So I don't. Even though he also has somewhat of a filmography, maybe not as big
as. Johnny Cash lived longer than Elvis did, obviously, and
right.
He meant a lot to his audience. And I think you're correct. He wasn't trying, like Yacov and I spoke about him being everything to everybody. Johnny Cash was not everyone's taste. It's interesting that I remember Johnny Cash, of course, from the Johnny Cash Show, which I think was on in the late 60s and early 70s, the same period, what we're talking about with Elvis. And I think what many people had at that period, variety shows, whether it was, Sonny and Cher or other recording artists. So that Julie Andrews, who was primarily a singer, although she was an actress, also had a variety show at that time. I think the idea of putting Johnny Cash on TV, for the networks, it made sense. They believed, especially if, you could get others around him, that would be something. He, and you're right, Yitzchak, there is a sense, the downtrodden feel towards Johnny Cash. He didn't spend that long in prison, but I think he became a favorite among those that had been imprisoned and were now free, that he somehow stood for them.
A lot of that was, again, which we discussed when we used to have the other podcast. It came from more of his religious background. He only maybe spent a few nights in county jail, but he looked at that idea of looking at his whole song about the man in black, caring about all these, people who nobody else seems to care about. And that was really, that was his ministry, really, more than anything else, was that and also, like his care for his interest in different cultures. He was somewhat like in the country music scene. He was, kind of like Plato's philosopher king. That he balanced that. Whereas Elvis was the king, but Johnny Cash was more the philosopher. He was the preacher. His getting into ideas of protests and things really came from a very visceral place. His care about the Native American communities and telling their story, and his interest, just in some of the Johnny Cash Show episodes, he'll highlight all these different cultures. He'll sing Waltzing Matilda. He'll cover all these songs that really were not the type of songs, and talk and try to explain what the words mean, and talk a little bit about the Australian culture, and then he'll sing different songs, and he was able to cover all these things in his own way. That whenever he would cover a song that was popular somewhere else, he always did it in a way that sounded unique and didn't sound phony, didn't sound there's so many bad music covers.
And I agree with you. I agree with you on that. That if this is Johnny versus Elvis, I'll agree with you. When Elvis, for example, one of Elvis's worst covers in my mind is "Bridge Over Troubled Waters." Right. And you can hear it, and you can see that he's struggling with trying to not just do what Paul Simon did. It really doesn't work. I heard it today mixed with the Royal London Philharmonic Orchestra. It sounded a little bit better. You're right. Johnny Cash had a way of taking a song and turning it totally into a Johnny Cash song. And what's incredible about it is he had maybe 1/5 of Elvis's singing talent. I mean, you got to admit that. I mean, yeah. Right. I mean, Elvis was smooth. Elvis could do falsetto. Johnny Cash is pretty much, the same monotone quality of voice. He's not going to, right? And yet, I agree with you. He did it with his power of presentation, and I would say, I guess that's an acting talent as well. A big favor. There was a film that I saw when I was growing up. It was called A Gunfight, and it had Kirk Douglas and Johnny Cash, and Kirk was sort of at the end of his, matinee idol career, although he did make a couple of other important films. And it's basically got, Johnny Cash's and Kirk Douglas share the screen. I think that, and even in the Columbo episode, which is probably one of the weaker episodes, and it's hard probably for people to accept that Johnny is a murderer, because in every Columbo episode you have to accept Dick Van Dyke's a murderer, and you have to accept that Leonard Nimoy is a murderer, and Peter Ustinov. So I guess you can accept that Johnny Cash is the murderer as well. But I think we could probably say that where he was used as an actor, he's probably was used more efficiently, asked to do as much. But I think you could probably make that case that he probably, let's say, vindicated himself more as an actor, perhaps, than Elvis did. Again, they both were in Memphis. They both recorded at Sun Records. They were together, I think, in the Louisiana Hayride. I think there was a lot of overlap between the two. And many people will tell you, I think they'll be on your side, that they find Elvis as bubblegum, and they find Johnny Cash as a real satisfying person to listen to. Again, in terms of where we're coming from, this is a podcast about film and about vintage TV. I would also say, again, I remember watching the Johnny Cash episodes when I was growing up. He would say, "My name is Johnny Cash." I mean, that's the way he would come out there, right? I don't know. I think he should have said "Clear the aisles." I'm not sure what he should have said, but when he got out there, he said,
"Hello, I'm Johnny Cash."
Hello, I'm Johnny Cash. Okay, right? Okay, yes. Hello, I'm Johnny Cash. Again, it was hard. You had Glenn Campbell out there. You have to know how to start any show or any. I understand it.
I mean, one of the things also we discussed was how you said Priscilla would have been nobody without Elvis, but June Carter was June Carter long before Johnny Cash was in the picture. They
look,
a power couple.
Yacov, I think you have to agree. Priscilla Presley would. What is she besides Elvis's wife? I mean, I did see the Naked Gun films. I guess that's acting. I don't know exactly. I didn't see Dallas when she was in it. I don't know exactly. But Yitzchak is right that, again, we're not really comparing the wives, but Johnny was embedded, and as River, what was it, Joaquin Phoenix's film, he was saved in a way, as you can see in I Walk the Line, by his connection to June Carter Cash. She was she was more of a performer than he was in many ways.
Yeah.
She had been singing longer. Her family was involved. And it seems like it was. So you believe that, although Elvis was a tremendous heart, but he was frustrated and sort of all over the place. And of course, as every Elvis movie points out, the terrible ending of what occurred to him. Do you think Johnny ends up as in salvation in a way? He actually, the persona that he exuded, the idea of seriousness, of thinking about a higher purpose in life and working towards a higher purpose. You believe that's where he was. You talked about Yitzchak,
and also like his, after he went through rehab, he went. It was like a tshuva me'ahava type of thing where he was, trying to be a good influence on other people, not to fall into drug problems and things. And his drug problem came from the painkillers a lot, same way a lot of things, today with the opioids, it wasn't so much a recreational type of thing, but he was, and he wasn't being preachy, he wasn't being holier than thou, he was being real, like, this really messed me up, and I don't want to see other people suffer the way I suffered. And so he had also, a big mission in that, and that's also a major type of redemption.
I think another thing that you pointed out to me that I didn't know was the amount of charity that cash, the amount of cash that Johnny gave out. Right? He was extremely generous. We know that Elvis was prone to like giving Cadillacs to people, or people that some woman that had helped him when he was young, he decided to knock on his door and, here's a Cadillac for you. But you're saying Johnny actually gave of his wealth and in a very stolid, important way, right? He said he was actually.
Yeah. I mean, the one story I read once was, because I have a book that I picked up for pretty cheap at a store for maybe $1.50 or something, which was written by one of the housekeepers in his house, and she spoke about how generous he was. And when he would go down, he had a house somewhere down in the Caribbean. He would just give out so much money to all the poor people there, buy shoes, buy clothes, just give them money and food and everything, and a lot of other stories like that where he would just give away a lot, because he grew up in poverty, and he knew what that was like, and he felt the blessing of his prosperity, was something that, he really had to share. That was his.
Say it again. We talked about these iconic singers, Elvis and maybe Johnny Cash. It's interesting when we just add Bob Dylan to the mix. And even though I think there is a concert film called Don't Look Back with Dylan in it, I think that Dylan, when he was in the film, the Sam Peckinpah film, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, Dylan plays a minor character there. And although I think one of Dylan's songs is in the soundtrack, Knock, Knock, Knocking on Heaven's Door is in the soundtrack. And that's a great song. And only Dylan could sing it. But Dylan could not make that move. Dylan could not, he can only act really when he's singing. He can only act when he's on stage and putting it into a song. He really, it's painful to see Dylan reading these lines. You can tell that he can't be there. So, I'm wondering, maybe, when we talk about this phenomena of performers, people of such spirit and soul. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, whatever you want to say about Johnny Cash's limited vocal range, he definitely was a person of intense spirit, a strong, and I think Johnny probably did again, that's why I'm going to make the case here.
I think he had more of a vocal range than Dylan has.
I agree with you, but he doesn't have his songwriting talent. He doesn't have the type of vision and the type of images in his mind. I mean, no one's giving Johnny Cash a Nobel Prize for A Boy Named Sue, although he didn't even write a Boy Named Sue. He didn't even write that song. The point, though, is I think
Shel Silverstein wrote it.
I think Johnny Cash is probably, if the Johnny versus Elvis, I think I could say that Johnny, as I mentioned before, makes the transition easier into the limited filmography that he has. I think he's able to do it. We talk about great performances in film. a person, look, Gary Cooper often was able to just do so much just by his presence. There was something he could do with the camera on his face. There was something he can exude. And of course, Coop was magnificent in so many films, but it almost became towards the end of his career, it was just his silence was something. And another person who could just, it was his ability to seem serious and exude a power to those around him. Clint Eastwood, almost all of his later films are like that. And I think that's something similar what Johnny Cash did, Yitzchak, is that part of it was you knew it was Johnny Cash, and yet he could play a character that was meant to be serious, meant to sort of like portend evil, death, change, or even what you're saying, changing his life. None of that stuff. Again, Elvis was never asked to do anything like that. He was just supposed to be the main character that would get in trouble, that people were to save the girl, whatever it was. I think the fact that Johnny outlives Elvis allowed Hollywood to find whether places where they could use the iconic aspect of him. And it's when you get these performances, these which you could say are just singing, but when you can see there a miniature epic within 4 minutes, the epic of struggle, the epic of loss, that note that's held. I think that's really where you get, and that's the classic aspect of song and film. And that's why they could, in a way, that can really exist independently of everything else that's around it. I would say, I come back to Judy Garland again. Was she robbed of an Oscar for A Star Is Born? Again, you could say, well, what was her acting in it? But when The Man That Got Away, isn't that worth about 45 minutes of dialogue? When you hear her sing The Man That Got Away, when you realize how powerful it is, how much it tells you about longing and getting older, as she says, it's fantastic. That you could say, it's only the lyricist, and it was only the person who came up, the person who wrote the music and the lyricist, but that's not true. And I point to Barry Manilow. I point to Barry Manilow singing "If I Can Dream." So it's almost, Yacov. And again, I'm sure in TCM and others, they've done these compilation films of things like that. That's entertainment. I'm not sure if they've taken just these epic singing parts, these epic songs that appear in a film that are.
My first job at TCM was I ran the fan club, and we once did a contest where people had to say who was the biggest Oscar snub in history. And far and away, Judy Garland for A Star Is Born was the winner. It was like every fifth nomination that we got was for Judy Garland in A Star Is Born. So it's very possible. I mean, there's a snobbery when it comes to singing in movies. People look at Fred Astaire and they say, it's so beautiful and it's so cinematic because it's motion. But when somebody is singing, they start to think, this isn't really a movie. This is a performance, but it could be a performance on stage, and it could be a performance on record. So there's a snobbery against music, and it's not fair because it discounts how it was shot and how it was cut and what exactly was being used in order to give over the emotion. But it also just really doesn't give enough credit to the actors. And there are a lot of them. There are a lot of people who gave great performances, musical and singing performances, who will never get really recognized because they consider it a lower form of acting in some way. They feel like the lyrics and the song and the music are conveying the emotion instead of the acting.
Well,
Yacov is it?
Go
ahead,
you
Yitzhak.
my my drama coach, Deborah Winger, she was not a singer, and she was also snubbed for the Oscars. So,
well, she was young, but it's.
I think there was listen, when you go up against Shirley MacLaine, who did not get her Oscar yet. I think she was in a tough situation there. It's I would say, Yitzchak, objectively, it's probably a toss-up. They both did a great job in terms of endearment. I think they were both very, very good. Who has the more real human performance? Deborah Winger, I would say. Shirley MacLaine is doing a character much more than Deborah Winger is in that film. But again, I think Yacov is right. They thought Deborah Winger would be coming back consistently. She decided that she had enough of it after a while.
She moved to Callicoon, and
yes, yeah. Yacov, I'm so happy that you saved my meandering rant by what you said. But I have a little lumdus to explain why that prejudice exists. Not that we need to get so deep into the minds of the people who are voting for Oscar, because many of them are just, fools and idiots and people who just happen to have been around for a long time. But I think what people got used to, especially the old ones, was that we're just going to stick a song in here, to put a song into the movie to sell the music. And many of the actresses were lip syncing to some other person who wasn't right. I'm not even talking about Marnie Nixon, who did the singing for Audrey Hepburn in My Fair Lady and for Natalie Wood in A West Side Story. This goes all the way back to films, all the films in the 30s and 40s where, the leading lady is also some sort of a lounge singer. So I think they got used to the idea that songs were phony, right?
Yeah,
that songs, yeah. And when you had someone like Judy who could belt it out in a way, I mean, as I said, when James Mason sees this singer, you're Nespoil along with him, because that type of power and talent just doesn't come along. And again, you're right. There is the prejudicial dismissiveness, and part of it, I'll say it even better. Having Astaire and Kelly sing in their movies downplays the significance of singing in general. It's almost like I want to say, being a rabbi, I'll say there's too many kollel guys because they give a bad name to the best guys. I understand it's a musical, and people will tell you Irving Berlin felt that Fred Astaire knew how to hit the notes better than almost anyone. But the truth is that once it's like anybody is singing, right? Jules Munchin is singing it on the town, right? The third guy, like, you have Dan Daly singing, in his musicals. Singing became almost like, well, as long as you can hit the notes and be on tune. It really, therefore, I think cheapens it when you have the type of like startling, shattering type of performances that you get from not just Ella Fitzgerald being able to break a glass. We're talking about like bottling power, life, intensity, and I think again the most obvious example is Barbara. Isn't it clear that that Streisand's Oscar and Funny Girl is basically 75% what she's able to do with her voice and singing?
Well, it was also just it was a coronation. It's her first movie. It's just it was that moment of, and first of all, she did tie with Katharine Hepburn, so it was a shared Oscar, but it was this moment of just her landing at the perfect moment with the perfect project, and it was also at that fascinating little time, maybe like maybe like 8 years or a decade long when Jews were sex symbols. And you had the
1 second, hold on.
Gould.
Who? Lauren Bacall did not put her Jewishness, on her sleeve. Who else would you? And
No,
Lauren,
but I mean a specifically Jewish look. The Barbra Streisand. She made her nose into her trademark, but Elliot Gould and the dark curly hair, and Richard
George Siegel,
and even Dustin Hoffman, with his almost unattractive attractiveness, his boringness was considered something really attractive for this.
I'm so happy you came today. I would never have thought about this this way. I'm so happy you really. This is a whole different take.
But that was part of Barbara's appeal. She was there at that moment, and everybody knew also, because it was Barbra Streisand, she was coming from the New York clubs and then from Broadway, that when she sang, she was singing. So it's like what you were saying, there was no fakery involved. And of course, that was part of the big budget musicals of the mid to late 60s that were all the rage, where you knew that the people that were cast were actually performing their own songs. So it was part of that trend too, but it was just that moment of looking at Barbara and saying, wow, this is the next big thing. And they were right. She was the next big thing.
And what she was able to do, she could insert into those incredibly strong notes, those high notes, she could insert such power. Don't Rain on My Parade.
But to give Barbara some other credit, though, she's also an incredibly good comedic actress, and half the movie is her being funny, the other half is her singing. So there's more to the performance than just the power of her voice.
Correct. Good. But you know what? A lot of actresses can do pratfalls, can do one-liners. I'm not saying she was very good at it. What's Up, Doc is another example of her quickness, what she's able to do. Poor Madeline Kahn in What's Up, Doc. But Madeline Kahn still steals the movie, by the way, in What's Up, Doc. Despite all Barbara shtickerai, Madeline Kahn is really great in the direct that they gave her to do. She is fantastic. She plays one of the most unattractive Jewish type of roles you could ask for, and she hits it out of the park, Madeline Kahn. But Streisand is a smart aleck. She is able to come up with Jewish type of give and takes and backs. But I really, again, I'll stick by it. It's because of the transformative power of her voice and what she's able to do in singing, which again really makes her something much greater than a movie star. She really is. I mean, Barbara, Judy, Elvis, these people that we're talking about, even while throwing Johnny Cash, of course, as well. That's what we're talking about. And I think that's, Barbara, yes, movies gave people the ability to see her, and to see her around, and I know she put her heart. I know, is Yentl 40 years older yet? I think
Yentl was 82. Yeah. So
yes. So I guess we could mention Yentl as well. But Yentl, which is so much of her personal, to her it was her most personal film. Her dedication to her Jewishness was Yentl.
I mean, Yentl is everything. My father used to say that only Barbra Streisand would cast Mandy Patinkin in a music.
Again, it's Barbara. It's Barbara that you're waiting to sing. Papa, can you hear me? I think in many ways, when you balance what she's about, it's overwhelmingly, the overwhelming amount is her vocal performance and what she can do vocally.
I don't know. I don't know. I'm going to push back. I think that she was a personality even before she hit movies. She was already going on TV. She was already a favorite of Groucho Marx. She could keep up with the big boys, and she could make the old men laugh. And she had and she knew this. She knew that, at least she said that her look, she knew her looks were untraditional. She needed to bring something else to the stage, and she was already a name. And I think she's really good in Yentl. I think the stuff that she does, she's playing. Remember, she's playing somebody that you have to believe that other people believed that she wasn't a girl, and she pulls that off. You have to believe that Amy Irving is falling in love with him being her. It's a tricky part.
Yes,
and
right.
It's not as tricky as Dustin Hoffman in the same year, being where Dustin Hoffman has to play, every different version of that. But because that he really transformed, but he also transformed from being a male, to a female, which is traditionally supposed to be harder than going from female to male. So I think she's rather good. I think Barbra Streisand gets a lot of flack for being Barbra Streisand and just being this unnatural talent. Although apparently she really, really worked to learn how to sing. It was not that she just came out of the womb doing every possible scale. She put in the time and she put in the effort. And so when she does those trills, she's doing them because she earned it.
Oh, right. And I'm not taking that away from her. It's funny, Yacov, that, although she did make The Prince of Tides and some other films where I don't think she sings at all. Even The Way We Were is she's not singing other than the title song that she sings in the beginning, which I think more people know that than they know the basic story between her and Redford in it. But her career really, she's not doing dramatic parts. She's not doing character actress. They had her in that in that with Dustin Hoffman. I think was it with Dustin Hoffman and the Fockers?
Meet the Fockers,
right?
Yeah,
right. So they had her in there, but she really has not in any way, gone back to being anything like a serious actress, right?
No, I think she almost she's very choosy.
Or what could she do? You know what I'm saying?
Well, she wanted to direct. Yentl was the big moment where she was going to break through and she was going to be the big female director. And there were so few. There were so few back then. And she never got, the credit, and she had to go and essentially raise all the money herself. It was very difficult. And so I think she realized, a lot of people who do who produce their own directing, the people even the ones who are phenomenally rich, like George Lucas, they consider it too difficult. It's just such a pain that they don't really want to go back. So maybe she just got tired of it. And
she definitely doesn't need the money, but I think the fact is that the moguls in Hollywood don't see in her the character that they need to put forth, to embody, to bring something out. And I think that really underscores my point that what she was this and she isn't that voice talent anymore either. She can't sing the way she did. She can't do in her I think she's 80 now, I think, or something like that. She cannot do what she used to do. And again, you could trot Clint out, one more time and come in, in Grand Camino. What was that again? Grand Torino. You could put him out there, but there really isn't much for Barbara to do. It's sort of like, it's similar to, Astaire, at the end of his life was just making a couple of cameo appearances somewhere. And I don't think Barbara would want to do that. So,
she also recognizes that as she's an icon. And icons are only diminished by
revealing them,
revealing themselves. So it's really she recognizes that she has power in holding back.
I will tell you though, as we end tonight, that it is, if you are going to, people who are listening to this show of us movie TV maniacs talking here, if you do decide to start looking and discovering stuff that's streaming, what's definitely worth your while is Elvis and Frank Sinatra. when they were welcoming Elvis back from the army. That was Elvis coming back from the army. Frank Sinatra did a special welcoming Elvis, and seeing those two together. There's a little shot of it in the Lerman film as it's ending. You can see a little, like 2 seconds of it, but that is a great scene. And I think one of the most powerful, incredible things to watch is the very young Barbra Streisand from 1964 singing with Judy Garland on her variety show. Those two, when they sing Happy Days, and they're both singing different songs, and together, that is also a transformative moment, because Judy starts out weak, and when Barbra starts generating some energy, you can see Judy get into it. And both of them really, it's the passing of the torch. It's again one of these things that we say, we are so blessed that we were able to capture that. And in a much minor way, but for me major, we were blessed today to have Yacov. Yacov, you got to come back. We definitely need your insight and understanding, and anybody, any friend, anybody who works for TCM is always welcome. Tell me, I love Eddie Muller. What type of would Eddie Muller? I mean, does he do anything like this, or is he too big to touch?
I don't know. It's a good question. He's very busy. He just had his Film Noir Film Fest up in San Francisco, and he does a lot. He writes a lot. Yeah. He's a restoration guy. So he's finding movies, and he does fundraising, in the same way other people do fundraising for yeshivas. He does them to restore film. And it's
all your hosts have got a different aspect to them, but I learned the most from Eddie Muller.
Well, Eddie also probably gets away with having the longest intros. So he somehow struck that as part of his deal, and he makes it work. So but he's wonderful, and he's a great guy. He's just a friendly guy who loves a good yarn, and he's a lot of fun.
Yitzchak, what do you think? You wouldn't want to have Eddie Muller? Oh boy, even 5 minutes of Eddie Muller on the show would be great.
Yeah,
I think so. All right. Well, my friends, watch your step on the way out. We'll catch you next time. Be well. Thanks for joining us for another episode from the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a single episode.